and welcome to Military History Inside Out, brought to you by WarScholar. We talk about military history from ancient times to modern, and everything in between. I'm Chris Alvarez, and thank you for listening. I'm speaking with Paul Dickson, author of The Rise of the GI Army, 1940 to 1941, The Forgotten Story of How America Forged a Powerful Army Before Pearl Harbor, published by Atlantic Monthly Press, July 7th, 2020. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you, Chris.
So first, how did you get into studying this subject and writing about it?
Well, I mean, I guess the long version of the story, which I end up telling anyhow, is I was born on July 30th, 1939, which was 31 days before the invasion of Poland by the Nazis and the beginning of World War II. And so I grew up during the war, and I grew up as a little tiny kid. In fact, it was all around me. I couldn't get away from it. My two uncles were both in combat zones in the South Pacific. My parents got Life magazine and Look magazine, which were intensely pictorial. So even before I could read, I'm leafing through these very large format magazines, looking at pictures of the war, and it affected a lot of things that I didn't realize till later. For example, there were no toys to speak of during the war. I mean, Fisher Price, the famous wooden toy manufacturer, was making ammunition boxes, and Lionel trains and American Flyer trains. And those companies were now making instruments for ships and for aircraft. So it was something that it was all about me. And I remember vividly VE Day. I remember, my whole neighborhood erupting, all the horns honking, and people throwing cans in the street and making all sorts of noise. And so all my life, I've you can do the math. I was born in 39, so I'm 81 now. But just my whole life, I've been interested in the war and reading. I've read an awful lot about it, and always thought as a writer that it was something I'd like to take a poke at. But every piece of it you looked at, there was already a bunch of people who had written about it and better than I could. I mean, just phenomenal writing. And even with fiction, you had phenomenal pieces of work. But all of a sudden, I got really interested a while back in the Louisiana maneuvers. It just sort of struck me as, well, why did they, 500,000 men in Louisiana? And then I started putting it together and started realizing that the real story that nobody had really done coherently, at least in my ability to find it, was this really amazing fact that in 1935, when MacArthur was still Chief of Staff of the Army, he said the Army could fit into Yankee Stadium. And not only could it fit into Yankee Stadium, but the Army wasn't prepared to defend the country. It was just a terrible Army. And somehow we went from that to the day of Pearl Harbor, when we had an army of 1.4 million. And all of a sudden it said to me, how do we do that? There wasn't magic. And a lot of people still assume that sort of the grand story is that we were attacked at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and immediately we raised this army from nothing. Well, it doesn't make any sense when you think about it, because that had to have started all of this draft boards, all of the mechanisms by which to give basic training, to build barracks, all that stuff had happened before the war.
And then on top of that, the material, all the weapons and the planes,
the
tanks,
aircraft,
aircraft, everything. So,
But and that was well covered. There have been a number of wonderful books about how we built this amazing aircraft industry, how we were able to give the British and other allies aircraft even before we entered the war on the Lend-Lease basis. But a lot of that was covered. But what concerned me was, and thinking of my uncles and the reality of the war, were the men, because you needed not only men, but you needed how to supply them. They had to be trained. They had to be well led. They had to be mobile. There had to be a supply corps behind them that could get, as in Louisiana, 2 million eggs a day were being consumed in Louisiana by the troops, and you had to figure out all that, which is equally, if not more important than the actual physical building of aircraft and munitions and howitzers and other things.
Mm-hmm. So how do you break down the book? Is it more like a personal story, or is it?
Oh no, it's a real look. It's a real narrative of the people involved, of the moments. It reads. I mean, several reviewers already said it reads like a novel, because and there are real heroes. I mean, they're one of the most interesting guys in the book. I think the pivot in the book that makes the most importance is in the middle of a very, very divided country, which we were isolationists versus, for lack of a better term, interventionists, to realize we'd eventually be drawn into the war. Mm-hmm. And a couple visionaries, but there was one of the guys who understood this and predicted it well before the thing started to really happen, was a man named Greenville Clark, was this very interesting lawyer in New York, who was very wealthy, from an old family, but he was a true patriot who basically worried about the future of the country. And in World War I, he'd actually worked on training officers, college graduates, as officers in the Army for World War I. But well before the war started, Clark and a couple other, for lack of a better term, defense intellectuals, I call them, but people who could really, think about what we really needed in terms of defense. One was Henry Stimson, who was eventually Secretary of War. But what happened was Clark started really early saying we really needed a draft, and nobody went along with him except for a sort of a group of elite people. Former generals, former admirals, the chairman of the New York Times, a couple of college presidents, became really fearful that both the Germans, the Nazis, and the Japanese and their warlords were going to eventually form an alliance and try to take over the world. Mm-hmm. Which is exactly what happened. So early on, Greenville Clark is saying we got to get a draft started. This is early in 1940, because he's starting to beat this drum. Mm-hmm. And in a meeting at the Harvard Club in New York, you can't much get more establishment than that. He and a bunch of them sit down. They get 100 people together. They hire a PR guy, and they start pushing the idea of a peacetime draft. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, it makes Roosevelt very nervous that he's running for re-election. He thinks a draft will probably be his undoing. George Marshall is chief of staff of the Army, and they're opposed to this. What Clark is doing, in a funny way, Marshall said he sort of resented a civilian sort of trying to lead the Army. But Clark prevailed, and he started to convince people, even in the midst of all the isolationists who opposed it. Mm-hmm. But he convinced them that we had to have this army, and we had to get it going quickly. We couldn't just pull one together out of a hat when we were attacked. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, he hires a PR guy, he hires writers, he hires all these other people to get this thing through, and he gets it through Congress in September 13th, 1940. Mm-hmm. 40. He gets the draft passed, and shortly thereafter, there's a registration day. Every American between 18 and 45 years of age has to register. Mm-hmm. Very little resistance. People who were screaming about, you're imposing it's peacetime and they shouldn't be drafted. Mm-hmm. And there were very, very few exemptions rather. Mm-hmm. And there were Vanderbilts, Rockefellers, Roosevelts, all drafted in this first draft. And so from this draft, and finally Marshall and Roosevelt understand how important this is. And even the isolationists very slowly start to realize we just have to become defensive, mm-hmm. and create this great army. And so the book is really about the heroics. It's really about the genius of George Marshall, mm-hmm. who basically puts together this army. And he does things that are, this is all part of the narrative, but Marshall does things that, in retrospect, are just brilliant. One of the things he does right before he calls for these for the draft. He has to get all these camps ready, but he realized there were morale problems. So here's the chief of staff of the Army realizing the morale problems, he actually answering letters from draftees who said, the food here is lousy. And then he'd call up or he's got in contact with the head of the base, said, why are these guys complaining about the food? But he was this guy who understood the absolute necessity of morale. I mean, to show the extent of what a genius he was at this, there's one point at Marshall's starting to feeling that a lot of these camps, there are tens of thousands of men being sent into these small cities and towns in the South, the far West, just gorging the town with guys with nothing to do on Saturday night and have their problems with it.
Yeah.
He shows up in one of these towns in civilian clothes, checks into a hotel, and wanders around for a couple nights talking to guys on the street. Mm-hmm. Nobody knows it. He's wearing a regular jacket and slacks. Mm-hmm. And I mean, he does that, but he also does things. He forces the beginning of Army OCS. Roosevelt and Stimson, a lot of the people didn't like the idea of taking the most brilliant enlisted guys and taking them out of the enlisted ranks and taking them to OCS, which is still in existence. Mm-hmm. And he really wanted to start this Army OCS, and Roosevelt said no, and Stimson, who was his titular boss, his Secretary of War, said no, we can't. We don't want to do this. We want to go, get the new junior officers, the college graduates. And Marshall said, well, and he said, if you don't let me have this OCS, I'm going to quit. And they said, what? And he said, I need to get a new corps of junior officers, and they have to be good. Mm-hmm. And the way to get it is to take the best of my enlisted men and turn them into officers. And they finally backed off. I mean, here's this guy threatening to quit. Mm-hmm. And of course, he immediately taps Omar Bradley to run OCS, and they take basically they distill the part of the syllabus from West Point, and they move it in, and they start it.
I'm speaking with Paul Dickson, author of The Rise of the GI Army, 1940 to 1941. You can find more information about his work at pauldixonbooks.com. If you like this podcast, Military History Inside Out, so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. If you want more military history ranging from the ancient to the modern, please visit warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com to sign up for my weekly newsletter and keep up with my latest posts. You can also find written interviews and my social media links there. You can find the links to my other podcasts at fullcontactnerd.com and technologyinspace.com. And now back to the podcast.
And just one more example, and there are many, many in the book, and they're sort of told in sequence, but mm-hmm. Towards in the fall of 41, right before Pearl Harbor, Marshall has watched these three huge maneuvers, which he staged in Tennessee, Louisiana, and the Carolinas. These involve, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men, over 700,000, and mostly, draftees.
Wow.
And towards the end, he realizes he's got some really bad senior officers. He's got about 200 fairly senior or very senior officers, including generals, mm-hmm. who are not up to it. They're either alcoholic, they have problems dealing with their men, they're preoccupied with some other part of their lives. A few of the generals in the reserves were more concerned about their businesses than they were about their position in the reserves. But he found this group that he felt he had to get rid of. Mm-hmm. And the press called it a purge, and he hated the word, but it was a purge. And they were either moved to sort of innocuous non-combat positions, mm-hmm. or they were asked to retire early. And he didn't go out of his way to embarrass them, but it was he just felt he had to get them out of the way. Mm-hmm. And in their place, he has his own group that he's ready to bring up. And it's Eisenhower, Patton, Mark Clark, Omar Bradley, Grunther. The list goes on and on. And these are the guys he brings up. And he has Eisenhower. He has Eisenhower in Washington 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, putting him in the War Plans Division. He's never met Eisenhower, but he knows all about the way Eisenhower's behaved all the way through. And he understands also that Eisenhower has this amazing ability to first deal with his men. They had an amazing rapport with his men. And B, had this amazing ability to deal with the press, with the media. They just loved it. It was just his casual way, his way of explaining complicated military issues. And but he grabbed this group. He was so brilliant. I overuse the word, but he understood that as he brought in all these recruits, is that he would need somebody to make film. He believed that film was one of the great ways of telling the story of why we were fighting in the war. And he brings in before Pearl Harbor, he brings in Frank Capra, who was probably the greatest film director of his time. Yeah. And he brings him in to make these films.
You alluded to a question I want to ask, or you kind of addressed part of it, but I can imagine them bringing in all these enlisted guys and junior officers, but how do you fill the huge need for, say, middle grade officers, like maybe captains or majors or lieutenant colonels?
I think again they were moving them up quickly. I mean, they were moving them the best of the best and the brightest, and he had people out there. He had a lot of his own these other people picking them for him. So he had Eisenhower had tremendous influence. So just up and down the line, these other guys were also part of a cohort, and they had their eyes. These were the career guys. Patton was very shrewd about getting this, and Patton also had an extraordinary ability, not only to find good officers for his divisions or his division, but he also had an amazing ability of taking recruits and draftees and turning them into absolutely first-rate soldiers.
How about who handled the budgeting for all this? Obviously they got the money, but then how do you manage it? It
was part of the staff that Marshall put together in Washington. So and they were very good about that. And they were also very, very interested in logistics and being able to move the equipment. So what they did in Louisiana, the big thing they did in Louisiana and the other maneuvers starting in Tennessee, was to put together an amazing sort of core of supply people who could move this stuff. And Eisenhower, in other words, when they're in Louisiana, they're all of this mock warfare is going in the swamps. There's no potable water, so they had to bring trucks of water in. They had to bring tanks in, not only get the tanks into these places, but also bring in the fuel. And it was. And Eisenhower says later, after the war, he said, when we learned to move all this stuff, moved an army through Louisiana into the Carolinas, before Pearl Harbor. That's what we took to Europe. That's how we were able to move across Europe and move up from North Africa. In through Italy into Europe, and then move inland across after Normandy, and so again it was again Marshall had this extraordinary ability to put together staff groups and interesting thing, I just forgot to say this earlier, but Chris, but the one of the things that mentioned the purge of the officers. One of the things later, H.G. Wells, the famous fiction writer, but also Wells wrote a lot about military affairs, and during the war he wrote almost exclusively about the war itself. One of the things Wells said later was, he said, one of the things that's happened during World War II, he said, one of the brilliant things the Americans did was to purge those men, those officers who were not up to the battle.
So you were saying that H.G. Wells was impressed that the Americans were willing to purge their officers?
Yeah, and one of the things he said it was one of the things that neither the French or the British had done, and he basically said that he thought that some of the bad decisions that occurred was because they hadn't gotten rid of some of the men who couldn't lead. Which is interesting, but it's interesting because Marshall, the more I wrote about, the more I started researching this book in 2005.
Mm-hmm.
I've written other books in between. This is my 70th book. Mm. So, but my realization about some of these men who I've always admired, but it was reading, researching, going after reports. I just began to realize how phenomenal they were. And this guy, Greenville Clark, who basically is this civilian with a great love of America, mm-hmm. and wants to protect her. And later in his life, he actually gives the money to Martin Luther King and the NAACP Legal and Education Fund to sort of affect civil rights. I mean, here's a guy that, he's tampering in everything, but he's tampering for his belief is the public good in this country. And looking at Marshall and his humble beginnings, and some of the things he did earlier for the Civilian Conservation Corps, where he sort of learns a whole lot of lessons about how to deal with a citizen army, mm-hmm. and Eisenhower and Patton's boldness even in these maneuvers, mm-hmm. where Patton does stuff that's just crazy, but brilliant. Mm-hmm. I mean, my whole frame of reference for the war changed and my book essentially ends at Pearl Harbor. So it was a wonderful time for me too, working on this.
Mm-hmm. Did you come across anything as to why they didn't, or what were their thoughts about integrating black soldiers into the Army?
That's a major subplot in the book, and it's a sad one because there's a great the black units really, or the black leaders really wanted integration. They wanted equality, and there was a whole business led by a couple of the major civil rights people who came down and wanted to have a march on Washington because the defense industries weren't integrated, and because the Army and the Navy weren't integrated. Mm-hmm. And A. Philip Randolph actually threatened to have a 100,000-man march on Washington on July 1st, 1941. Mm-hmm. And Franklin D. Roosevelt convinced him not to, got him to call off the march. And, of course, that march came about later under Randolph's direction, after the war, with the famous March on Washington. Mm-hmm. But it's a sad tale, and there were phenomenal stories of inequality. There was one unit, it was a reserve unit, which I think is the most, in a sense, the most emblematic story. There's a 93rd Regiment, which was part of the Second Army. Mm-hmm. It was an all-black reserve group in Massachusetts, and it was all black, and the officers were black, and it was a Jim Crow army. It was a segregated army.
Right.
But this unit wasn't allowed to come to the Louisiana maneuvers. They were barred from coming in with the rest of their larger army. Mm-hmm. And the reason was they were so fearful that there'd be a black colonel, and a white lieutenant would have to salute him, or a white, let alone a private or a corporal. Mm-hmm. And it was that bad. And the guys, the units, they really fought. The black units, a lot of them fought under their own motto, which was the double V, which was victory over fascism and victory over Jim Crow, or segregation and inequality. Mm-hmm. And I tell the story I go all the way through the Truman edict. And even 50 years later, I end the book by sort of knitting all this together. 50 years after the Truman edict about integration of the military, the Secretary of Defense Cullen, who was then 50 years later was Secretary of Defense William Cullen, was head of Secretary of Defense, and he said that finally, 50 years after the Truman edict, finally, the military had become the best example of the best element of racial integration in all of American society. It was the most, not that there wasn't room to improve, right, but it had become the model for the rest of American society. And Cohen was one of my advisors in the book. In fact, he wrote a blurb for the back of it. But I think it, and I think that's the one downside of this whole story. Mm-hmm. But again, the black soldiers, the African American soldiers, you know, they performed well, and they struggled to have a equality. And we're still struggling, even in defense industries, all the way through the war. I mean, they just weren't allowed to, you know, there was one aircraft company, the only blacks they would hire would be for janitors. And
yeah.
But that's part of this. That's sort of the sub narrative to the larger story.
Mm-hmm. So when they were creating this force, I would assume that they would, training wise, they would focus on the basics, like, you know, marching, shooting, being able to live outdoors. You know, was there any more to that with this short time period they had?
Oh yeah, they acted like a real army. They learned to do these things in these maneuvers that were extraordinary. They were extraordinary because they had a lot of people working with them, and so Piper Cub, you know, they loaned them a whole bunch of aircraft, which of course become these small aircraft. So they learned to use these aircraft. They're experimenting with new tanks and new munitions. Mm-hmm. They're building pontoon bridges. In Tennessee, it takes them a couple of days to put together a pontoon bridge. As they get moving and learning, all of a sudden they can put together a pontoon bridge in a matter of hours instead of a matter of days. Mm-hmm. So they're doing all of this stuff in this large scale movements. Plus, they're learning. They have trucks down in Louisiana and places with cobblers, with shoemakers on the trucks who are, you know, filling their shoes. So they start to learn to do all of these things moving towards the front. Mm. And the great thing about the guys who were the citizen soldiers, I say that because most of these people were draftees by this time. Mm. These guys, they were a different breed than had been in World War I. They were even though they come through the Depression, they come through. They said that one of the first things a guy would come in, and the first thing he'd do, he'd look at an airplane, or he'd look at a jeep, or he'd look at some sort of armored vehicle, and the first thing you knew, he'd be under the hood of whatever the vehicle was, or whatever the helmet was, you know, looking for a way to make it move faster, because they grew up looking under the hoods of Model A Fords and, you know, and LaSalle's and all these old cars, and so they were attuned to that whole business. That the other thing, which sounds astonishing when you think about it, these guys could read maps. And map reading was a real skill in World War I, and there were talks of these things like lost battalions and things, but there was a real deficiency. They didn't understand them, and the guys who were coming in 39 and 40, 41, had grown up on gas station road maps. They could read maps. They understood the concept of maps. They understood the concept, and they could easily learn about terrain and such. So they were an extraordinary group, and they trained them to do an awful lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. And also, Marshall was changing the old World War I, the divisions to triangular divisions. So they were learning to behave as a unit. Mm-hmm. They also had tremendous deficiencies. They're one of the things when an enemy aircraft would come up, even though it was black, would come over, they'd run out with their brownie cameras and take pictures rather than take cover.
Let's turn to how you did the research for the book. You alluded, or you mentioned a few items. What did he use primarily? Did he go to archives, or what sort of research?
Well, a lot of this stuff, I had expected for a long time that a lot of it would be in terms of formal reports. There were very few Army and military documents that survived other than umpires' manuals, because all of these maneuvers were judged by the great teams of umpires. A lot of it was going through archives. For example, I'll name one example. Eric Severide, the great reporter for CBS, who had been in Europe earlier and then came back, and sort of the highest guy in the CBS radio at the time, and he wrote in his memoirs, and I got transcripts of all of his broadcasts. I got a lot of transcripts of things that happened during the maneuvers.
Mm-hmm.
I also got access to all the newspapers. There were a lot of daily newspapers, so I was getting that kind of stuff. And there were a lot of memoirs. There were a lot of historical memoirs written in which people wrote about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Marshall and Mrs. Marshall wrote an awful lot about it. The Marshall archives are just phenomenal, and they have all of his letters digitized. They've got a huge amount. So I learned heavily on that. I use the Eisenhower Library in Abilene.
Mm-hmm.
I use the Pritzker Military Library in Chicago, which is an extraordinary, probably the best place you can imagine to do military research or military research on them. And I spent days and days there at the beginning. They helped me immeasurably. And I used unit histories. I used just about everything I could find. I spent an awful lot of time on just developing these sources.
Mm-hmm. What part of the research was most enjoyable for you?
I think, yeah, that's a great question. The most enjoyable thing was I had these pieces, and I was sort of obsessed with, and all of a sudden they came together in a story, and the storyline was so simple.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in 1935, the Army fit into Yankee Stadium, and by Pearl Harbor, you had a 1.4 million man citizen army, because they weren't all these. They were not necessarily the long-term guys. They were guys pulled out of their jobs in barber shops or whatever they were doing,
mm-hmm.
and realizing that this was the nucleus of the Army that went into by the fall of '42. They were in North Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And they were ready to take on the Nazis on the ground, and so it was not pretty at first, but that was the nucleus of the Army that went to North Africa, up through Sicily, up through Italy, and into Europe in the final days of the war, and so you have it just was once it all fell together, it's like doing a big crossword puzzle, and all of a sudden. You're down to about 12 pieces, you got it made. But this was just, it just all fell together. And I actually think it was interesting to me. The other thing I kept seeing was there was tremendous division in the country when this happened. This was all done under duress. There was the isolationists who were they almost got, at one point in the fall of 41, they almost took the Army down. I mean, the House of Representatives saved the Army by the 203 to 202.
Oh, wow.
And if that vote had gone the other way, Marshall said the war would. They were going to send home hundreds, thousands of troops that had already been drafted. So the isolationists wanted to bring them home early.
Mm-hmm.
And if that had happened, Marshall said later, the war, it probably would have meant. If that had passed and that had stuck, the war would have lasted several years longer, and that meant another hundreds of thousands of American deaths.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of it was just seeing today, as an old man, seeing the country in division, and then seeing the country then in division,
mm-hmm.
and saying to myself, wait a second. The only way we're going to make it is to get out of this and bring us together.
Mm-hmm. And
that was just. And the other thing is a very upbeat story about America. And right now a couple of the reviewers have been well reviewed in the newspapers and things.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of reviewers said this is a great story about America, and it's a great story to make you proud to be an American. And I think that we need stories like that right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm speaking with Paul Dickson, author of The Rise of the GI Army, 1940 to 1941. You can find more information about his work at pauldicksonbooks.com. If you like this podcast, Military History Inside Out, so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. If you want more military history ranging from the ancient to the modern, please visit warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com to sign up for my weekly newsletter and keep up with my latest posts. You can also find written interviews and my social media links there. You can find the links to my other podcasts at fullcontactnerd.com and technologyandspace.com. And now back to the podcast. When they were forming this army, did they expect all of these men, like, legally, I guess they could make them fight through the whole war, but were they thinking in terms of they'd have like year-long enlistments and then go home, or was it the idea that...
Originally it was year-long enlistment.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a big movement when it looked like they were going to be extended. There was a movement called Ohio. There would be chiefs, stenciled OHIO,
mm-hmm.
which meant over the hill in October. There was some threatening to desert if they got extended.
Mm-hmm.
But it ended up amounting to nothing. It was more of a slogan than anything else, but there was grumbling when they were extended, and even when they were drafted.
Mm-hmm.
These guys didn't want to go. I mean, there was no mass resistance. There were conscientious objectors, many of whom were religious, like Jehovah's Witnesses, who had resisted Hitler and been put in concentration camps for it.
Mm-hmm.
But there were people who had that, and there were COs, conscientious objectors, but there was no massive resistance to it. There was no saying, I'm not going to wear a mask, pardon me. But, the irony of it was the first thing that happened to you when you went into basic training,
mm-hmm.
because of World War I, you had to learn to wear a gas mask and wear it for hours in training.
Mm-hmm.
But there was no, it was interesting, and people, very powerful people got drafted, and they couldn't get out of it. I mean, they probably didn't want to, but the head of the New York Stock Exchange is drafted.
Mm-hmm.
And he has to get on a train and go, on a subway train in Manhattan, go down to the draft center, get on a bus, and they set him off to some army camp in New Jersey.
Wow.
To start basic training.
Mm-hmm.
And the people that did get exempted, other than people with large families or dependent families,
mm-hmm.
Were people who, for example, if you were a superintendent in an aircraft factory building aircraft,
mm-hmm.
you were exempt.
Yeah.
But if you were the chairman of the board of a large corporation, you were not exempt unless that corporation was Chrysler, which was building tanks, or somebody like that. But I mean, the amazing thing too was the degree to which an awful lot of people were 4F. It changed us in a lot of ways. That they had terrible teeth,
mm-hmm.
and there were things that changed our diet because of that first draft. They found out that a huge number of draftees were lacking in iron, niacin, riboflavin, all these different minerals and vitamins. And they started, literally, the guy would walk in and look healthy, and you realized he had no stamina because he was lacking these things.
Wow.
So the government started getting the bakery companies to put all these ingredients into flour. So if you go to the supermarket and buy a bag of enriched flour, that has been enriched with all these elements which were lacking in the diet in 1940, and were bringing huge numbers of people ineligible for service. And you didn't hear much complaining about it. I mean, people were told the government was trying to get all these bakers, and got them all to agree to this enriched flour. But it was really to save lives or to keep people healthy. And
mm-hmm.
But to me, that was the other interesting thing, was finding these peripheral stories that sort of came out of the narrative,
mm-hmm.
like that about the mount. And the other thing was this sense of serving. I mean, they found an awful lot of guys were ineligible for the draft because they had bad teeth or no teeth, or their teeth were in terrible shape.
Mm-hmm. And
there was this whole corps of dentists who basically volunteered without pay to fix these guys' teeth,
mm-hmm.
And make them eligible. And a lot of them, there was a great trade-off. Like, they were in terrible pain.
Mm-hmm.
So you had this sense of a country that was, even before the war, even before Pearl Harbor, this country that was determined that it wasn't going to get pushed around, it wasn't going to get, invaded. And when Greenville Clark sold the draft, he talked about, he said, there'll be a day, if England falls and France falls and the rest of Europe falls, there'll be a day when Nazi ships will pull up the Potomac River, take Washington, move to Baltimore, Philadelphia, and then up to New York, and basically we'll be defenseless if we don't get ready.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a crazy thought, but yeah, it's he made a good point. Was there a particular question you wanted to really get an answer for that you did, but it took a while to, or perhaps you'd still love to get an answer for it?
No. That sounds arrogant to say that, but I did work on it for a number of years, and I got a lot of help. I mean, and from professionals and readers, and I had a great editor. A book like this was 2 major rewrites, 2 editings, 3 editings, 2 copy editings. I mean, and I had people working on it with me. I had a couple of retired brigadier general in the Air Force, but whose knowledge of military history is superb. I have an old friend of mine, he's now just turned 91, who was in the cavalry in World War II. Armored, they were armored by then, but he was in the cavalry.
Mm-hmm.
And I had him. I had a lot of people read it, and I sort of felt that I had worked on parts of it right till I submitted the manuscript, but I think I felt that I'd come to grips with most of the things I wanted to look at, wanted to think about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the one that still amazes me, I guess there is one thing that still absolutely amazes me, was when we decide we're going to go invade North Africa in October of take on Rommel and help the British. And when that decision is made, we've got to move this huge group of troops over to the western shore of Africa, North Africa, and the Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm.
How we got those guys there without the Nazis finding us, and without them, I mean, they had to create. One of the reasons we couldn't do it earlier, they had to create the landing craft. We had to create all this stuff for a major amphibious landing.
Mm-hmm.
In an area we knew nothing about. I mean, we hadn't trained there or anything, and so we had to land these guys and these tanks and everything else that went with it, and get them all over there without being detected. I mean, they had to leave. Some left from north. We had some of them up in Northern Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them were in Newfoundland. Some were in Bermuda. Some were in the deep south, and some were in Newport, Rhode Island. I mean, they moved them out from all these different places. But how we pull that off without losing ships and without losing men, it still fascinates me how we pulled that off.
Mm-hmm.
And the ability to make sure there was no leak in their head. We hadn't been penetrated by Nazi infiltrators or spies who could figure this out.
Mm-hmm.
We did send a decoy group over, which went up into the North Atlantic,
mm-hmm.
and which made a lot of noise. But again, it's World War II is an interesting thing for people not only of my age who actually was alive, but younger people. I think it's still an amazing story. I mean, we are fighting 2 huge powers on either ocean, and we'd always believed as a country that we were, because of the oceans, that we were protected, that the oceans would protect us forever, and I didn't.
Yeah. What was, and this is outside of the scope of the book, but I'm curious what the feeling was when, after the war ended, but then 5 years later you have the Korean War. I'm just curious, do you recall what people were feeling? Was there a sense of sort of sadness that it's just, you thought war would be over for a while, but it wasn't?
Yeah, I think I'm going to sign my pay grade on that one. Because I knew I was older then as a kid, and I knew a lot of neighbors and people in my church and stuff who went to Korea.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't a popular thing. And people did it, and but there was a real hardship to it, and it was a real, not anger, but I mean, I think in World War II you came back with a great deal of pride, and you were rewarded with the GI Bill. I think with Korea, I think a lot of people who had to go over again, especially the pilots.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking of Ted Williams. I'm thinking of a lot of of course, the most famous, the baseball player, who was a pilot, Marine pilot in both World War II and Korea. But there was one line I remember reading once that on the aircraft carriers in Korea, the pilots had no trouble flying the aircraft carrier because the sunshine would bounce off the bald heads of all the men that brought back who'd fought in World War II.
Yeah.
And I think that was a lot. I think a lot of the guys felt, look, I've already done it.
Mm-hmm.
And but there wasn't massive resistance or anything. It wasn't.
Right.
And it was an abstraction in a way. I mean, I remember being a kid, and you'd say Korean War in school, and the teacher would say, no, it's a police action. It's not a war. And technically, that's what it was. And
Interesting. So, speaking of the GI Bill, I know these guys were drafted, but what other benefits were they offered or given just to keep morale up, apart from good food or better food and that sort of thing?
I think, again, it was Marshall's brilliance. I think he created in them a spirit that was unbelievable. I'll give you one example.
Mm-hmm.
When you were drafted in 1940 or in 41 before Pearl Harbor, you were handed a thing called the soldier's manual, and it was written by Marshall and his staff. Marshall was the editor. He wrote this thing. It was very much like the Boy Scout handbook. It was talking to these guys as citizens, not as people who were there to be ordered around. And it wasn't a traditional military approach of, historically, you guys are cannon fodder and you follow our orders kind of thing. It was Marshall. And one of the brilliant things he does, for example, in the back of his manual for soldiers, he has a whole slang dictionary. He has a thing, if you're going to go AWOL, the AWOL's in there, over the hill's in there, chow is in there, all these terms. And so what Marshall is doing, and what Marshall and other people are doing, and what the world itself is doing, is they're developing this sense of cohesiveness. Mm-hmm. That these guys are different. These guys are GIs. They're not Revolutionary War soldiers. They're not World War I soldiers. These guys are GIs, and they have their own cartoonists. And all of this was supported. Malden and Brager, and all these World War II cartoonists who came out of Louisiana. All of these things like the movie industry. There was a guy like Bob Hope in my book the book I've written is a big hero. He starts entertaining the troops early in the war. I mean, he's with the troops in combat zones, and he's John Steinbeck, the great writer who's working for a newspaper, writes about Pope as one of the great heroes of the war because of what he did for the morale of the guys, and it was keeping that up. It was creating these groups like the USO, and and this great deal of entertainment, the great feeling these guys had as that dreadful as the war was and how all-consuming it was. Mm-hmm. These guys came out proud, and the GI Bill. I had my uncle bought a farm on the GI Bill. He went to agricultural school and bought a farm.
Nice.
And he bought a farm that had failed in upstate New York, an apple orchard. It was a farm with orchards. Mm-hmm. And he bought it and he brought it back to life, and he lived there and worked there. He had formed a construction company as well as the farm. But everywhere you turned, when I was growing up, there would be people who had benefited from the GI Bill. And the college I went to, it had a huge impact on the GI Bill. And you look at the some of the great universities and how they had prospered with the GI Bill guys. Like George Bush Sr. went to Yale for 2 years on the GI Bill, and it was I think that it was the model for how we should treat our veterans.
Mm-hmm. Did this early group that you studied, did they also, were a lot of them put into the Army Air Corps, or was the Air Corps more from the active duty, the regular Army?
No, the Air Corps was, you could, once you were drafted, you could request the Air Corps. Mm-hmm. And certain people, like Jimmy Stewart, who failed his physical and actually put on, this is the morale of the country. He fails his physical because he's underweight. One of our greatest actors, he just won the Academy Award as the greatest actor in the country, in a film. And he puts on weight just so he can get in the Army. Mm-hmm. And he's a pilot. He's a great pilot. Mm-hmm. And as soon as he gets in the Army, he passes. He has somebody at his movie studio put him on a diet so he can get enough weight on him to go in. Mm-hmm. And Stewart then goes into the Army, and within a week he's convinced them to transfer him to the Air Corps. Mm-hmm. So it was based on guys who either had experience, draftees, or who showed tremendous aptitude for navigation, any of the air attributes of the air, the aerial navigation and all these other things, mm-hmm. as well as being pilots and other functionaries and mechanics and people like that. There was a special group that formed its own elite. Mm-hmm. And the Air Corps was actually kept black pilots out, and it was one of the reasons that the black pressure on blacks who wanted to fly. There were a lot of black aviators in the country at that point. Okay. And that's the beginning of the Tuskegee Airmen. The Air Corps finally realizes these guys really want it, and we got to make a place for them. Mm-hmm. And they do. And of course, it's a sad story because of how it happened, but it's a great story about how it turned out, because those guys were particularly honored now in retrospect.
Yeah. Apart from just filling the historical gap, what do you hope the book will do for readers?
I hope it gives them just a new understanding of how great this country can be when it's properly led, when it's got sort of this amazing public citizenship, this ability, for people to sort of demand to be involved in it and to win out for the country. I think it's a tonic. I hope I've talked to people who said, your book made me smile for about 2 hours when I finished it. And so I think it's to bring us back, and it's not made up. I mean, it's not something I just made up out of the blue. Mm-hmm. It's actually what happened. The arc of the story is, we won the war. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I just hope it gives people a new realization. And somebody accused me of saying, well, I'm just another one of these people talking about what, the greatest generation kind of thing, as if that's a bad thing to do. I'm not saying they were the greatest generation, but they were a great generation of people. Mm-hmm. And they come out of the Depression. They have every reason to be angry. Yeah. They were broke. A lot of them went in, and it's the first time they gotten good food in their lives in the Army. Yeah.
So did you have any difficulty? Well, you said the book took a while to write because you worked other projects as well, but were there any difficulties in getting it finished or published?
No. I had a great editor right from the beginning, mm-hmm. and a great agent, and I had no, it wasn't. I've been doing this for years. It's like mm-hmm. It's like asking an architect if he has a hard time getting that building built, and I build enough buildings. Mm-hmm. And my only other I did two other military. I did one book called The Bonus Army about the 1932 bonus marchers who were the World War I vets, and I did another book on the automated battlefield, which is really about Vietnam and Laos and the Westmoreland, like the first use of drones, the first use of electronic sensors widespread and all that.
Interesting.
And I did another book called Chow, which was a book about military food. But so it wasn't hard. I mean, I think I had friends. I think the people in the military that I talked with or worked with are the people at the Marshall Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
I think once they realized what I was up to, I think they were really pleased that I was doing it. It wasn't like it wasn't like an expose for it. It was basically telling the story.
Mm-hmm.
And the bad guys in the book are the Nazis and the warlords of Japan.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's your either current or next writing project?
I'm playing around with a couple ideas. When in this day and age, especially the coronavirus era, promoting a book like this is a major job. In other words, working on different places, doing virtual interviews, doing podcasts, doing all this stuff. And so I'm sort of working on this one from now through Veterans Day, just to make sure that it's, spending all this time on it, that it's well positioned. It's doing quite nicely now.
Yeah.
But I want to keep that up. I want to keep feeding them. And I'm playing with a couple ideas. I've read a lot of baseball books. I may write something like that. But I'm 81 years old, so it's not like I got to prove something and do another one. Right. But it'll probably not be anything as ambitious as this. This is a major flexing of the muscles that I've got left.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the rankings on Amazon are very good. Excellent, in fact.
Yeah.
Where can people find you online? Do you have social media or web page?
I have a web page called Paul Dickson Books, DICKSON, PaulDicksonBooks.com.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, and all those things, and people can find me on there. But Facebook is probably my best place, and I welcome people joining that. We talk about a lot of things. We try not to be political because we get out of that every day, and but sometimes, yeah. But I talk about the book a lot because I'm getting, when I get a good review, I just got a good review in Army Magazine, and I'll put a little review up. So.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just spell your name for listeners. So Paul is Paul and Dickson is Dickson.
Yes, sir.
All right. So that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
Not really. I just appreciate this, and I really appreciate talking to your legions of followers.
Good. Yeah. No, it was really interesting stuff that you brought up. So yeah, I appreciate your time as well.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, Military History Inside Out, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. If you want more military history ranging from the ancient to the modern, please visit WarScholar.org or MilitaryHistoryPodcast.com to sign up for my weekly newsletter and keep track of my latest posts. You can also find written interviews and my social media links there. Thanks for listening.